The unhurried year of a walled kitchen garden. There is a particular kind of quiet that belongs to a walled kitchen garden in the hour after dawn, before anyone has come to work in it. The light arrives slowly, sliding down the eastern wall and pooling along the gravel paths, and the air inside the walls is warmer and stiller than the air in the fields beyond. This is not an accident. The walls were built precisely to make this happen, to gather what little warmth the day offers and to hold it, to shelter the soft fruit and the tender seedlings from the wind, and to give the gardener a small, defended square of ground in which the seasons could be coaxed to run a little earlier and a little later than they did anywhere else. A walled garden is, in its quiet way, a machine for slowing down and stretching out time, and to walk through one in the early morning is to feel that slowness settle over you like a blanket. The walls themselves are usually of brick, and there is a reason for that too. Brick holds the sun's heat through the day and gives it back through the cool of the evening, so that a peach or an apricot trained flat against a south-facing brick wall enjoys a climate several degrees warmer than the open garden, warm enough, in the gentle damp of the English counties, to ripen fruit that would otherwise never come to anything at all. The bricks are often laid in particular bonds, and the older walls may be hollow, built with a cavity through which, in the grandest gardens, small fires or flues of hot air could be sent to keep the frost from the blossom on a cold spring night. Most walls were never so elaborate. Most simply stood, foursquare and patient, 8 or 10 or 12 feet high, enclosing somewhere between 1 and 4 acres of carefully tended ground, and that was enough. The head gardener, in the days when such gardens fed a great house, kept the whole place in his head as a kind of calendar made of soil. He knew, without writing it down, when the broad beans should go in and when the last of the leaks would be lifted, when the glasshouse needed damping down against the heat and when the vents must be closed against a coming frost. His year did not begin in January, not really, because a gardener's year has no clean beginning. It is a wheel, and every task is the consequence of a task done months before and the cause of a task to come months after. But if we must pick a place to step onto the wheel, let us step on in the deep quiet of winter, when the garden is at its most bare and most resting, and when the work, though it does not stop, slows to the gentlest possible pace. In winter the beds lie open and dark, turned over by the spade so that the frost can get into the broken clods and crumble them. This is one of the oldest pieces of gardening wisdom, and one of the most pleasing to consider, that the gardener does not need to break the soil down finely himself, but only to turn it up roughly and let the winter do the rest. Water seeps into the clods, freezes, expands, and splits them from the inside, so that by spring the rough-dug ground has been shattered into a fine tilth by nothing more than the patient alternation of cold nights and milder days. The gardener, having done his digging, can stand back and let the weather work for him, which is perhaps the most restful arrangement in all of horticulture. He turns the heavy soil 1 spit deep, laying each spadeful over and back so the weeds are buried and the surface left rough, and then he moves on, and the cold takes over. There is digging of another kind in winter too, the digging of trenches for the following year's runner beans and celery, trenches that are filled with manure and rotted vegetable matter and left open to weather through the coldest months. The smell of a winter garden is the smell of this, turned earth, and old leaves, and the sweetish, not unpleasant smell of well-rotted manure, and underneath it all the cold mineral smell of frost on stone. The robin comes to watch the digging, as robins always have, perching on the handle of the fork the moment the gardener steps away, dropping down to take the worms and grubs the spade has turned up. This small companionship, the gardener and the robin, is one of the oldest and most constant scenes in the English garden, repeated every winter for as long as there have been gardens and spades and robins to watch them. The glasshouse in winter is the warm heart of the cold garden, though warm is a relative word. In the great gardens the glasshouses were heated, in the earliest days by hotbeds of fermenting manure and later by hot water pipes fed from a coal-fired boiler tended day and night by a boy whose entire job, through the winter, was to keep the fire in and the frost out. To step from the raw cold of the winter garden into the still, damp, green-smelling warmth of the glasshouse was to step into another country, a country where geraniums kept their leaves and where, in the deepest gardens, a grapevine slept along the roof and a few late chrysanthemums still held their heavy heads. The gardener moved among the staging, watering sparingly, for in winter too much water is the enemy and a plant kept slightly dry will sleep safely through the cold while a plant kept wet will rot at the root. He picked off the yellowing leaves, he watched for the gray fur of mold, he turned the pots so each plant had its fair share of the weak winter light, and otherwise he let them rest. There is a great deal of resting in a garden, and a great deal of waiting, and this is something that the impatient never understand about it. The gardener spends far more of his time waiting than working. He sows a seed and waits. He plants a tree and waits, sometimes for years, before it gives him anything at all. An asparagus bed must be left for 2 full years after planting before a single spear may be cut, and a well-made asparagus bed will then go on giving for 20 years, so that the gardener who plants it is making a quiet bargain with a future he may not see. The walls of an old kitchen garden are lined with fruit trees that were planted by gardeners long dead, trained over decades into their flat, fanned, candelabra shapes, and a young gardener coming to such a garden inherits the patient work of his predecessors and adds his own patience to it, knowing that the trees he prunes today will be giving fruit to gardeners not yet born. The training of the wall fruit is among the slowest and most absorbing of all the garden's arts. A peach or a pear or an apple is planted as a young whip against the wall, and then, year by year, season by season, it is persuaded to grow not as it wishes, bushing out into the air, but flat against the brick, its branches tied to a framework of wires or to nails driven into the mortar joints, spread out like the fingers of a hand to catch every scrap of sun. There are named forms for this, each with its own logic and its own discipline: the fan, in which the branches radiate from a low point like the ribs of a fan; the espalier, in which pairs of horizontal arms run out from a central stem at regular intervals like the rungs of a ladder; the cordon, a single stem grown at an angle and hung with fruiting spurs along its length. To make any of these takes years of careful pruning, of pinching back the shoots that grow the wrong way and tying in the shoots that grow the right way, of cutting always with an eye not to this year but to the shape of the tree 5 and 10 years hence. The gardener who trains wall fruit is drawing slowly in wood and time, and the wall in high summer, hung with ripening peaches against the warm brick, is the finished drawing. When the year turns and the first faint lengthening of the days can be felt, the garden begins, very gently, to wake. The seed potatoes are set out to sprout, laid in shallow trays in a cool, light, frost-free shed, eye end uppermost, so that by planting time each tuber has grown a cluster of short, sturdy, green-purple shoots and will leap into growth the moment it is put in the ground. This setting out of the seed potatoes, called chitting, is one of the small quiet rituals that mark the very beginning of the gardener's active year, and there is something deeply satisfying in the rows of trays in the dim shed, each potato in its place, each beginning, in its slow potato way, to stir. The sowing begins under glass long before it would be safe to sow outside. In the warmth of the glasshouse and the frames, the first seeds are sown in pots and pans of fine sifted soil, watered with a can fitted with a fine rose so the seeds are not washed away, covered with glass and paper to keep them dark and moist until they germinate, and then, the moment the first green shows, uncovered and brought into the full light so they do not grow thin and weak in the search for it. The gardener watches over these seedlings like a nurse, for they are at their most fragile in the first weeks of life, vulnerable to cold, to damp, to the collapse called damping off that can level a whole pan of seedlings in a night. He pricks them out when they are large enough to handle, lifting each tiny plant by a leaf, never by the fragile stem, and settling it into its own small space with a little wooden dibber, and the pricking out of seedlings on a quiet spring morning, hundreds of them, one after another, each handled with the same unhurried care, is work that empties the mind of everything but the task in hand. The hotbed is the old gardener's clever answer to the cold of spring, and it is worth describing slowly, for it is a beautiful piece of practical reasoning. A great heap of fresh stable manure and dead leaves is built up and left to begin its fermentation, turned once or twice to even it out, and then, when it is settled into a steady warmth, a frame is set on top of it and a layer of fine soil spread within, and into this warm bed the seeds are sown or the young plants set out. The rotting manure below gives off a gentle, steady heat for weeks, a slow underground fire of decay, and in this artificial spring the gardener could raise cucumbers and melons and early salads long before the open garden was warm enough for any such thing. The frame had to be watched, the lights propped open on warm days to let out the steamy heat and closed at night against the frost, the bed sometimes renewed with fresh hot manure packed around its sides, and all of this was judged by hand and by eye, by the feel of the warmth and the look of the plants, in the days before any thermometer was thought necessary. As spring strengthens, the work moves outdoors, and the garden fills, bed by bed, with the year's vegetables. The peas are sown in their flat-bottomed drills and given their twiggy sticks to climb. The broad beans, sown in the autumn or the earliest spring, are already standing in their dark green rows. The onions go in, and the shallots, and the first early carrots and parsnips and beetroot, each in its allotted bed, for the kitchen garden was always laid out in a careful rotation. The crops moved around the beds from year to year so that no piece of ground grew the same thing twice running and exhausted itself. The cabbage tribe followed the peas and beans, which left the soil rich, the roots followed the cabbages, and so the fertility was passed around the garden in a slow 4-year wheel, a piece of wisdom worked out by generations of gardeners long before anyone understood the chemistry that explained why it worked. The paths between the beds were kept as carefully as the beds themselves. In the great gardens they were of gravel, raked smooth, edged with low borders of box clipped tight and neat, or with espaliered fruit, or with simple boards, and a part of every week's work was the raking and weeding and edging that kept them trim. There is a particular peace in the raking of a gravel path, the rhythmic drawing of the rake, the small ridges it leaves. The way of freshly raked path seems to settle the whole garden into order. The box edging, clipped once or twice a year with shears, gave off its strange, warm, slightly bitter scent when the sun was on it, a scent that anyone who has worked in such a garden remembers all their life, and the clipping of it, the slow progress along the edge with the shears going snip, 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 and the small green clippings falling onto the path to be swept up after, is among the most meditative tasks the garden offers. Summer is the garden's loud green height, though even its loudness is a quiet thing, made of bees and the bean flowers and the trickle of water and the distant sounds of the world beyond the walls. The great work of summer is watering, and in a large garden before the days of easy plumbing this was an enormous undertaking. Water carried in cans from the dipping pond or the rainwater tanks, a can in each hand to balance the load, walking the paths again and again through the warm evening to give each thirsty bed its drink. The water was given in the cool of the evening or the early morning, never in the heat of the day, and it was given generously and to the root, a good soaking now and then being far better for the plants than a daily sprinkle that wets only the surface and tempts the roots upward to where the sun can find them. The dipping pond, a small still tank of water warmed by the day, sat at the heart of many a kitchen garden, and the dipping of the can into its quiet surface, the small disturbance and the slow settling, was one of the steady rhythms of the summer evening. The glasshouse in summer is a jungle. The grapevine that slept along the roof in winter is now heavy with leaf and with the slowly swelling bunches that must be thinned, berry by berry, with long narrow scissors, so that the bunch can hang loose and each grape can fatten without crushing its neighbors. This thinning of the grapes is famously patient work, the gardener standing for hours among the warm leaves, snipping out perhaps half the tiny green berries from each bunch so that the half that remain may grow large and even and perfect. The tomatoes are tied up and their side shoots pinched out. The cucumbers are trained along their wires. The whole house must be damped down in the heat, water thrown on the floors and the staging to raise the humidity and cool the air, and the vents opened and closed in step with the sun, and the blinds drawn down at midday in the hottest weather, so that the gardener is forever adjusting, forever judging the balance of heat and air and moisture by feel. The kitchen, all this while, makes its steady demands, and the kitchen garden exists to answer them. Each morning a basket of vegetables goes up to the house, whatever is at its best that day, picked at the peak of its freshness in the cool of the morning, the first peas, the new potatoes, the tender lettuces, the asparagus in its short and precious season, the soft fruit gathered with stained fingers into shallow baskets so the lower berries are not crushed. The relationship between the garden and the kitchen was close and constant, a daily conversation conducted in baskets, the cook asking for what she needed and the gardener providing what was ready, the two of them between them turning the slow growth of the beds into the meals of the house. To grow food for a kitchen is to be tied to a rhythm older than any clock, the rhythm of ripening and gathering, of gluts to be used and gaps to be planned around, of the asparagus that must be eaten now because in 3 weeks it will be gone for another year. And then, gradually, almost imperceptibly, the year turns again toward its rest. The light softens and slants. The mornings carry the first faint coolness that says the summer is ending. Autumn is the season of harvest and of storing, of gathering in the year's slow labor and putting it carefully away against the coming cold. The main crop potatoes are lifted on a dry day and left on the surface for an hour or two to dry before they are gathered and stored in a dark, cool, frost-free shed, layered in dry sand or earth or simply heaped in the dark, for a potato exposed to light turns green and bitter. The onions are lifted and laid out to ripen and dry, their tops bent over, their papery skins hardening in the late sun, before they are tied into ropes and hung in an airy shed where they will keep through the winter. The apples and pears are picked, each one tested with a gentle lift and twist, for a ripe apple comes away easily into the cupped hand while one that resists is not yet ready and must be left a few days more. The storing of the apples is a slow and careful autumn ritual all its own. The fruit room, cool and dark and airy, is lined with slatted shelves, and the apples are laid out on them not touching, each one given its own small space so that if one should rot it cannot spread its rot to its neighbors. The keeping varieties are chosen for this, the late apples that are hard and sour off the tree in October but that mellow slowly in the dark through the winter months until, by Christmas or by February, they have come into their full sweetness. To walk into a well-kept fruit room in the depth of winter is to be met by the extraordinary smell of stored apples, a deep, sweet, winey fragrance that fills the cold air, the smell of the whole summer gathered and held in the dark, slowly ripening still on its silent shelves. The gardener went through the fruit room regularly, by candle or by lamp, turning the apples, lifting out any that had begun to go, and this slow inspection of the stored harvest, fruit by fruit, in the cold and the quiet, was one of the last gentle tasks of the dying year. The leaves come down, and they too are gathered, not thrown away, for the gardener wastes nothing. The fallen leaves are raked up and packed into a wire cage or a simple heap in a corner, where they will sit, doing nothing visible, for a year or two while the slow work of decay turns them into leaf mold, the dark, crumbly, sweet-smelling substance that is among the most precious of all the gardener's materials. There is no hurrying this. Leaf mold is made by time and damp and patience alone, by the leaves simply being left to rot at their own unhurried pace, and the gardener who packs the leaves into the cage in November is, like the gardener who plants the asparagus, making a quiet investment in a future season, trusting the slow processes of decay to do their work while he attends to other things. The last of the tender things are cleared before the frost can take them. The frames are filled with the plants that must be protected. The glass house is given its autumn clean, the glass washed inside and out to let in every scrap of the failing light, the staging scrubbed, the pots stacked and sorted. The boiler is lit again, and the boy is set once more to keeping the fire in through the lengthening nights. And the beds, as they are cleared of the last of their crops, are dug over again, turned up rough to the coming frost, so that the wheel comes round to where we began, the bare dark beds lying open under the winter sky, resting, waiting, with the spring already coated into them in ways too slow and too quiet for any eye to see. There is, woven through all the seasons, the quiet matter of seed. The thriftiest gardeners saved their own, letting a few of the best plants of each kind run on past their eating prime and into flower and seed, marking them so they were not gathered by mistake, and watching over them as the seed ripened and dried. The peas and beans were left on the plant until the pods were brown and brittle and rattled when shaken. The lettuce and the onion were allowed to throw up their tall flowering stems and set their small dry seeds, and all of it was gathered on a dry day, rubbed out from its pods and husks, winnowed clean in a gentle breeze or by the breath, and stored in paper packets and labeled tins in a cool dry drawer against the coming year. To save seed is to close the wheel of the year completely, to take from this season's plants the beginning of next season's, and there is a deep quiet satisfaction in the drawer of saved seed in winter, each packet a small folded promise of green to come. The labeling mattered as much as the saving, for seed unlabeled is seed half lost, and the careful gardener wrote on each packet the kind and the variety and the year, in a clear hand, knowing that next spring's certainty was being set down now in pencil while the memory was fresh. Some seed kept for years and some for only one, and the knowing of which was part of the slow accumulated craft of the work. And there is the tool shed, or the bothy, the gardener's own small kingdom, where the tools were kept and mended and where, on the wettest days, the indoor work was done. The spades and forks and hoes were not simply flung in a corner but cared for, cleaned of soil after every use, the blades wiped and, in the old way, plunged into a bucket of oiled sand to keep the rust from them, the wooden handles smoothed by years of hands until they shone. A good spade, well cared for, would outlast its owner. The shears and the knives were kept sharp, for a clean-cut heels and a ragged tear festers, and the sharpening of a pruning knife on a wet stone, the slow circling of the blade, the testing of the edge against a thumb, was one of the small contented tasks of a rainy afternoon. Seed potatoes were sorted here, and bulbs, and the string and the labels and the raffia were kept in their places, and the whole small room smelt of soil and oil and twine and the particular dryness of stored wood. To sit in the bothy with the rain on the roof, mending a tool that would be needed in a month's time, was to be at rest while still, in a small way, at work, which is perhaps the most contented condition a gardener can know. This is the deep truth of a garden, and the most restful thing about it, that almost everything important happens too slowly to watch. The seed swells in the dark earth. The root reaches down. The leaf mold forms. The wall holds its warmth. The apple mellows on its shelf. The young tree settles into its trained shape over years and decades. The gardener does his small daily tasks, the digging and sowing and watering and pruning and gathering, and the great slow processes of growth and decay and the turning seasons do the rest, working away quietly, ceaselessly, at their own unhurried pace, asking only for patience, and giving, in return, the deep and steady peace of a walled garden in the early morning light, where the air is still and warm within the sheltering brick, and there is nowhere at all that anyone needs to hurry to be.